at Obesity the Lecture. Now, you know that I'm a low-carb doc, okay? And I'm so glad that I'm around a friendly audience, because we often get slices of pizza, sticky buns, and other assorted carbs thrown at us because nobody wants to give up their carbs, okay? So to that end, all good lectures should start out with a joke. At least I think they should. And this is my joke. Okay, that's the truth of it. Especially people don't want to give up sugar because it's highly addictive. It's as addictive as cocaine or heroin or anything else. So the problem you face is that people are basically trapped, and I like to think of it as they're in the quicksand, and you can throw them the rope of low carbohydrate diets, but unless they grab onto the rope, you're not going to be able to pull them out. So what can cause obesity besides the metabolic syndrome? Okay, everybody here has patients with the metabolic syndrome. Well, certainly probably the next most common cause would be hypothyroidism. Okay? And then after that, you're getting to real zebras. Cushing's syndrome, Prader-Willi, insulinomas, they're vanishingly rare. And they certainly can cause obesity, and there are other inherited conditions that might cause it. But the fact of the matter is that the elephant in the room is metabolic syndrome, okay? It is so common. They actually just did a second look at the NHANES data, the latest NHANES data, and they used the latest cut points for the metabolic syndrome. And only 12% of Americans aren't positive for at least one criteria on the metabolic syndrome checklist. So you all are seeing lots of metabolic syndrome in your clinics. And there is no difference between metabolic syndrome and diabetes. I like to call it diabesity, okay? Just like there's primary syphilis, secondary syphilis, and tertiary syphilis, metabolic syndrome is just primary diabetes. And then secondary diabetes is pre-diabetes. You actually get the A1C above 5.7. And then tertiary diabetes is when you get above A1C 6.5, or you go over 200 on a non-fasting specimen, or 140 on a fasting specimen. So it's not two diseases. It's not that metabolic syndrome is something different than diabetes. What do they all have in common? What causes them? It's high insulin levels. And we're going to talk. So what do I want to talk to you guys about today? Well, the first thing I want to get into your heads is that people who are fat are not moral failures. They didn't do something wrong. They're not guilty of something. They're not evil. They're not lazy. Don't have any self-control. It's they inherited, okay? And we're going to talk about that. And obesity is not a simple matter of calories in, calories out. You can't calculate. He ate 3,500 calories more than he burned, so he's going to put on a pound of weight. That doesn't work, okay? And we're going to talk in detail about why that doesn't work, okay? And the next one is eating less and moving more is not going to help you. We're going to talk in depth about exercise and how it relates to weight loss. We're going to talk about why calorie-restricted diets don't work. They give short-term results. Yeah, you can lose a little weight on a calorie-restricted diet, but they're unsustainable, and they can permanently lower your basic metabolic rate. So I would not recommend prescribing or going on a calorie-restricted diet to anyone. When I eat till I'm Thanksgiving full. Now, exercise contributes very little to weight loss. We talked about that. Ketogenic diets are sustainable and effective. I've been on a ketogenic diet for 6 years. I've been at ideal body weight for 4 years, okay? We're going to look at some studies that are now into their third year where they're sustainable and going well. And we're going to talk about the weight set point for your body. Your body has a set point that it wants to weigh. And if you eat fewer calories, your body's just going to turn down your basal metabolic rate until you get back to the weight it wants to be. Okay? If you eat so many calories that you get above what your body wants to be, the set point, your body is just going to speed up the metabolic rate, and your temperature is going to go up, your heart rate's going to go up, and all those things until you get back down to what the set point is. And what we want to do, if somebody walks in that's 350 pounds, we want to turn their set point down to 200 pounds or something like that. And I'm going to explain to you the ways that you can do that, okay? And they can stay at 200 pounds and not be hungry and not be stressed, okay? And the big complaint that most doctors say is that ketogenic diets are going to increase your risk of coronary artery disease. Well, this is not true, and I'm going to show you some data that proves that that's not true. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. And without further ado, we talked first about moral failing. Okay, well, we know that obesity is primarily a genetic disease. Now, we all know, we talked about in that one study, that there are 12% of people who eat the American diet and they don't develop the metabolic syndrome. I personally don't think it's that high. I think if we did something called a Kraft assay, and what a Kraft assay is, you give people 100 grams of glucola, or glucose to drink, and you draw their blood every hour for 4 hours, and you look at the rise in insulin over 4 hours after the 100 grams of glucola, then that is the earliest way to detect the metabolic syndrome. If you have the genetic tendency, okay, to become insulin resistant in the environment of high fructose and high linoleic acid environment, which is what we have in the United States, okay. In the United States, before 1911, the average ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, by the way, linoleic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid, okay? And it's found in very high concentrations in soybean oil, which makes up 52% of all the calories, fat calories that Americans eat are eaten in the form of soybean oil. You wouldn't believe how many soybeans are grown in the United States, okay? And it's in everything, all your processed foods, your cupcakes, your salad dressings, your ice cream. They put it in everything. And omega-6 fatty acids go through the cyclooxygenase pathway to produce inflammatory mediators. Omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory. You certainly need some of them because inflammation is a healthy part of your immune system. But when we used to eat omega-3s, which are anti-inflammatory, and omega-6 is in a ratio around 1.1 to 1, okay? And now we're eating them in a ratio of 1 omega-3 for 40 omega-6s, which is what the average American is eating. We're getting tremendous levels of body inflammation as reflected in the high CRPs you're seeing, the high IL-6s, okay? And so we think that some combination of high linoleic acid and high fructose intake. If fructose all is in sugar, half of sugar, and high fructose corn syrup, and it's everything you eat. Okay, just about they put it in because it sells. They want to make money, and fructose is addictive and tastes good, and it's in everything. And fructose is processed in the liver in the same pathway that alcohol is. It causes fatty liver. Okay. Take the fatty liver away, as Dr. Lustig did for just 2 weeks, and you can reverse fatty liver on all the markers. So it's why they officially, a third of people have fatty liver in the United States. And I think it's probably higher than that. I think they've just set the cutoff too low. Okay, I don't think you're supposed to have much fat in your liver because fat in the organs is about 50% macrophages or pus cells by volume. So that's what causes the metabolic syndrome, is we think it's because we're living in this environment of high fructose and high linoleic acid. And how do they know that it's primarily genetic? They did these wonderful twin studies in Holland, and they said, we conclude that genetic influences have an important role in determining human fatness in adults, whereas the family environment alone has no apparent effect. Dr. Stunkard calculated approximately 70% of the variance in obesity is familial. So it's a familial problem. Unfortunately, most people have it in the United States. We evolved to eat primarily fatty meat. We extinguished 31 species of large herbivores. Unfortunately, in a 2012 online poll, 61 of U.S. adults believed personal choices about eating and exercise were responsible for the obesity epidemic. This is the bad data that is out there. Unfortunately, people believe it. Okay. If you want to believe that you can lose weight simply by cutting your calories, okay, then there are certain things you have to believe. You have to believe that calories in and calories out are independent of each other. In other words, if you eat less calories, okay, then your expenditure is going to stay the same as it was. Okay, your body's going to keep expending the same amount of calories no matter what you ate. And that's like saying a coal plant is still going to produce the same amount of heat no matter how much coal you put in it. It's kind of ridiculous. You have to assume that the basal metabolic rate is stable, and it is not stable, and we're going to look at several studies that show that it's not stable. Okay? We can reliably exert conscious control over our calories in. There are tremendous forces in our brain, not only in our desire centers, but in our centers of the brain that inhibit rash behaviors are shut down by sugar. And so there's all kinds. It's really hard. You can do it for a while. You can have self-control and not eat more than when you're hungry. But to do it for a prolonged period, it's just not sustainable, and it's just not going to happen. It doesn't happen in most large studies. We're going to look at the Women's Health Initiative with 50,000 women and how that didn't work for them. Okay? And then another one is assuming that fat stores are essentially unregulated. If you want to believe calories in, calories out, you got to believe that if you you need 3,000 calories and you eat 2,000, the body's going to be able to pull 1,000 calories out of fat. Well, it obviously can pull some out of glycogen, but that's going to run out. And then it has to pull it out of fat. And can it get it out of the fat? But the fat's under hormonal control, as we're going to see, so that's not always possible. And we're going to, you have to believe that a calorie is just a calorie. Well, a calorie of carbohydrate is going to produce a whole lot more insulin, which is a very powerful hormone, which we will talk in depth about. And then a calorie of fat is going to produce almost no insulin. Okay, so a calorie is not a calorie, and we're going to go through all this. Okay, so assumption one, calories in and calories out are independent of each other. False. If you decrease your calorie intake, the body responds by decreasing both total energy expenditure and resting energy expenditure. And we've known that for a long time. Here are a couple of famous studies. Okay. Way back in 1919, that's 100 years ago this year yet, guys. We're at anniversary. At the Carnegie Institute of Washington, they had 5 volunteers who consumed a semi-starvation diet of 1,400 to 2,100 calories, 30% lower than the usual intake. And that's kind of about the range where a lot of dietitians recommend you've got to get your calories down. And they teach them how many calories, and they put it on all the packages, okay? And then, so what happened? The patients experienced a 30% decrease in total energy expenditure from an initial caloric expenditure of roughly 3,000 calories to approximately 1,950 calories. So if you eat less, your body will slowly decrease its metabolic rate to accommodate, to get back to its set point. You haven't changed the set point. Okay. Now this is a famous one that happened in the Minnesota Health Study. 36 young, healthy adult men ate 3,200 calories for the first 3 months. They were in a 12-month experiment, and they were students at the University of Minnesota. And for 6 months after the 3-month initial stabilization period, okay, during which they had their basal metabolic rate, their abdominal girth, their strength, and all sorts of things measured, so they could get a baseline. After the 3-month stabilization period, they were put on a starvation diet. And they started at 1,570 calories per day, and then they were weighed weekly, and their calories were continuously reduced to generate weight loss of 24% from baseline. And some of them got less than 1,000 calories a day by the end of the study. They averaged 1.1 kilogram or 22.5 pound weight loss per week. Their diet was potatoes, turnips, bread, and macaroni, and meat and dairy were rarely given. This was supposed to simulate the diet of post-World War II Europe and all the devastation that occurred there. Okay? They walked 22 miles per week to try to generate, to move more, okay, to try to generate calorie expenditure. And they were targeted at a calorie expenditure of 3,009 kilocalories per day. And so what happened? Okay. Resting metabolic rate dropped by 40%, and average strength dropped by 21%. Resting heart rate dropped from 55 to 35, and stroke volume decreased by 20%. Average body temperature went from 98.6 to 95.8. Okay. Here's how one of the participants described it. I'm cold. In July, I walked downtown on a sunny day with a shirt and sweater to keep me warm. At night, my well-fed roommate, who isn't in the experiment, sleeps on top of his sheets, but I crawl under 2 blankets. That's how it was on a calorie-restricted diet. So that's what we're doing to our patients when we cut their calories by 30%. Okay. The men experienced a complete lack of interest in everything except for food, which became an object of intense fascination to them. This is a quote from Ansel Keys, and he wrote a book on this. This isn't actually an article. And some hoarded cookbooks and utensils. They were plagued with constant, unyielding hunger. Some were unable to concentrate, and several withdrew from their university studies. There were several cases of frankly neurotic behavior. One subject amputated 3 fingers of his hand with an axe. Sexual interest was drastically reduced. Patients should, if you do calories in and calories out, they should have lost 35.3 kilograms or 78 pounds. What did they actually lose? 16.8 kilograms or 37 pounds in the experiment, okay, after all that suffering. Okay. Now, what's assumption 3? We can reliably exert conscious control over calories. Okay. Well, here we are at the Women's Health Study. Now, Women's Health Study, 50,000 middle-aged women, okay, were divided into 2 groups. One group, the intervention group, was counseled, was encouraged to eat low-fat, high-carb diet, and to reduce calories. They also were encouraged to move more and had some training in how to exercise and walk and those sorts of things. And they were very good. They managed to reduce their average calorie intake from 1,788 to 1,446 calories, of course, calculated from these bad food diaries that they sent, or this food questionnaire form that they sent in. They reduced their percentage of, I didn't fix that slide. They reduced their percent fat calories from 38 to 29. They increased physical activity by 14%. And what did they get for all this? Okay. Well, at first, during the first year, they started losing some weight. I think they lost about 12 pounds. And then by the end of the first year, the weight began to creep up because, as I told you, calorie-restricted diets are just not sustainable. Okay. And by the end of the 7th year of the study, there was no significant difference between the intervention group and the control group, which were given no instructions at all, just told to eat their normal diet. There was absolutely no statistically significant difference between the 2 groups in terms of weight or waist circumference. You can't willpower yourself thin on a long-term basis. It just doesn't work. Now, assumption 2, basal metabolic rate is not stable. We already looked at the Carnegie Institute of Washington study and the Minnesota starvation study, and that's obviously not true. Okay. Here's another study that shows that not only does the basal metabolic rate go down in response to calorie reduction, but that it stays down even after you return to normal eating, okay? And I'm going to show you a couple of studies about that. So you can permanently damage your metabolism by going on a prolonged calorie-restricted diet. In this study, these people they were studying OptiFast, and they studied it for 20 years. OptiFast is a liquid diet. It's 500 calories, and you used to go into the hospital to get it, and they would do blood testing, but I think they did it outpatient. But you only get this 500 calorie protein drink, and they had over 100 patients in these trials. They were trying to get it approved for weight loss, that lost 10% of their body weight on the OptiFast. And after this initial weight loss, they were given a low glycemic diet with enough calories to maintain them at their new lower weight, and they were followed for a year. And after 1 year on the new diet, the total energy expenditure was still 500 kilocalories a day below baseline. Now there's even bigger one. Did anyone here ever watch The Biggest Loser show on television? Okay. It was a show on television where these contestants would go on, they would basically starve themselves on a low-fat, high-carb diet, and they would do all kinds of intense exercise, and the one who lost the most money, the one who lost the most weight won money, which is a good thing. So it actually turns out that they did a study of some of the contestants. So 16 participants in the Big Loser competition were signed up, and they had DEXA scanning and their resting metabolic rate measured before the competition began, after the weight loss, and 6 years later. Okay, so they really did good. They lost a lot of weight. I guess money is a really good incentive not to eat, and to cut your calories. So they lost 58 kilograms, 128 pounds. That was the average weight loss. After 6 years, the average weight gain of the lost weight was 41 kilograms. So they regained most of the weight, and it was kind of interesting that the ones who continued the exercise and eating program were more likely to regain all the weight they had lost, even though they continued the intensive workouts and the diet. Okay, there was a persistent, and then at 6 years, their resting metabolic rate was still 499 kilocalories per day, less than when they started the show. So you can have permanent damage to your metabolism from calorie restriction. And I used to calorie restrict all the time. I don't doubt that my metabolism was totally messed up. Okay. We exert conscious control over calories in. Well, we do to some extent, but it's not perfect. Okay. In fact, and the longer you calorie restrict and the hungrier you get, the weaker your self-control gets, and the more likely you are to start overeating. Even subconsciously you can do it. But this was an interesting study I found on it. In this study, 6 obese patients who had achieved a 10% weight loss. Again, this was the OptiFast guys. Okay, they actually gave them subcutaneous doses of either leptin or placebo, and then they placed them in a functional MRI scan and showed them images of desirable foods. Okay, and the areas of the brain controlling emotions and cognition lit up in response to the food stimuli. Areas of the prefrontal cortex involved with restraint showed decreased activity. Many of the changes were reversed in the patients who received leptin. Well, we'll talk about leptin a little later, but I just thought it was interesting that your self-control is impaired by calorie restriction. Okay, so some people can do it, but it's very, very few people that have that kind of self-discipline. Okay, assumption 4, fat stores are essentially unregulated. Well, I thought there were 2 easy ways to show you that that's not true. That's absolutely not true. First of all, insulin is the master fat storage hormone. you can make anybody fat by giving them insulin. We're going to show you studies that show that a little later on here. But these people usually inject their insulin either in the lower abdomen or in the upper thigh. And these are insulin injection sites where people who've been on long-term insulin injected their insulin. And you can see how it caused localized fat deposition. Okay, so the fat stores are under hormonal control. And if your insulin is high, you're not going to be able to get your fat out to burn it. Okay. So here's another example. And the thing here is that before puberty, okay, boys and girls have almost the same amount of body fat. Okay. After puberty, girls develop a heavy fatty layer under the skin. They normally do, unless they starve themselves. Okay, and that's all under hormonal control. In this case, it's the sex hormones that do it, the estrogen. Okay, so obviously, fat is not free flowing. It goes in, it comes out. It's under hormonal control. Okay. Okay. Assumption 5: a calorie is just a calorie. Where I already told you that a calorie of carbohydrates can cause you to secrete a whole lot more insulin than a calorie of fat is, and a protein is somewhere in the middle. Actually, whey protein that they put in these protein shakes generates the same amount of insulin as a gram of carbohydrate, 1 gram of whey protein. So it's 100%. But most proteins, it's 50 to 75%. Okay. Now let's talk about the fallacy that exercise is a good way to lose weight. Okay. One of my favorite. People always tell me that they're going to get their patients to exercise more. Well, first I need to talk to you about how some of these studies were done. I thought it was actually interesting. It just changed the subject from it. Does anybody know what doubly labeled water is? Okay. Water is H2O. Okay. So if you doubly label it, you put a stable isotope, replace both an H and an O with a stable isotope. In the case of the H, it's deuterium. In the case of the O, it's O18, which is a stable isotope of oxygen. Okay, and if you give people this to drink for about 3 days, okay, and build up a stable level in their body, and then you take a urine sample from them before you want to start measuring their total energy expenditure, and then you take a urine sample from them at the end of the period you want to take the total energy expenditure for, say a day, okay. What you can do is the deuterium can only come out in the sweat and the urine because there's no hydrogen in carbon dioxide. The oxygen 18 only comes out in the breath and as carbon dioxide. So you can get a ratio of deuterium to oxygen based on their baseline ratio, and you can tell exactly how many calories during that period that they expended. I'm going to show you a study about the Hadza people, okay? And for me it's interesting because they're the hunter-gatherer tribe that's the favorite of the vegetarian crowd because they eat a fibrous, starchy root that for a lot of the year when they can't get game. It turns out that the elephants, they used to eat elephants, but the elephants have all been hunted out, and so they've turned to this fibrous, starchy root. And if you talk to them, they also eat honey. Their number 1 favorite is honey. Their number 2 favorite is any kind of meat they can find. And if they're desperate, and I've got a peer-reviewed article on this, the diet of the Hadza, in case you're actually interested in it. But they will eat the fibrous root if they're desperate. They hate eating it. Okay, it's their least favorite food. Okay, so anyway, the Hadza, and what we're going to talk about now is exercise. So people say if you move more, you're going to lose weight, okay? And they say, well, look at the Hadza. They're thin and healthy. They don't get obese. They don't get diabetes. They don't get heart disease, okay? And it's because they're so active and they're moving around. They're hunting animals and they're doing all this stuff. Well, they actually went to Tanzania, where the Hadzas live. Let's go here. And they gave them doubly labeled water, okay? And then they measured their activity and they compared it against U.S. farmers, U.S. City dwellers, okay? And and to see who was burned more calories during the day. Okay? So let's look how it came out here. In the study, doubly labeled water was used to measure TEE in 3 populations: Hadza, U.S. city dwellers, and farmers. No statistically significant differences were found between the 3 groups. U.S. city dwellers, on average, burned slightly more calories than the Hadza, but it didn't reach statistical significance. And there's the actual numbers here. The Hadzas were really the lowest. There's the Hadza women, 1877, men, 2649, and the Western women, 23 compared to 1877 for the Hadza, 30 compared to 26, and 28 compared to 26 for the Hadza men. So it's not because they're moving more or burning more calories that they're thin and healthy. Okay. Now, some people say that, well, activities declined during the obesity epidemic. The epidemic started after the government guidelines came out in 1977 with the food pyramid, telling people to eat carbs. Okay, and and so people say, well, people are just getting lazy. They're taking their car everywhere. They're sitting in front of their computer and their television. They're just not doing anything. Well, actually, that's not true. They have data on that. In this 2008 Dutch study, they examined the daily energy expenditure trends from 1980 to 2008 and found that it had gone up. Does exercise work for losing weight? Okay, and so what did the meta-analysis conclude? It concluded there's initial modest weight loss in studies lasting less than 16 weeks. So if people are usually zealous, they get into it, and their bodies, they lose some weight, but then the bodies start to compensate. And in long-term studies, there's little to no permanent weight loss. And you can see that it pretty much goes flatline in the longer studies. And we're going to talk about some of the longer studies here. Okay. So if you could design a study to tell, is vigorous exercise without a change in diet going to help me lose weight? Okay, and you could design a carefully controlled study to prove that. I think it would be this study right here that they did in Silver Spring. In this 10-month study, 141 overweight and obese patients, BMI 25 to 40, were randomized to no exercise, 400 calories per day, and 600 calories per day, supervised. I mean, they watched them. Aerobic exercise, and for 10 months, this must have been an expensive study. At least 70% maximum heart rate. They had 5 sessions per week, and they were dropped from the study if they didn't complete 90% of their exercise regimens. Okay, they were told to eat ad libitum as much as they want and not make changes in their diet. So this isn't a diet study at all. This is a pure exercise study. So what happened? Okay. The biggest weight loss was in men on the 600 calorie program who lost a whopping 5.9 kilograms, 13 pounds, okay? And they averaged 0.6 kilograms per month. The women on this intense program lost 4.4 kilograms per month or 9.7 pounds. The predicted weight loss using the calories in, calories out calculator was 16 kilograms or 35 pounds. So they only lost 13 instead of 35. So in this study, the males went from an average initial weight of 225 pounds to 212 pounds. For 10 months of 5 times a week, 600 calories an hour is running. Okay, running for an hour, it's not a big reward. Okay, so exercise can help you lose weight. Okay, but my personal opinion on exercise is that if you can get people's insulin down and open up the energy flow so the fat can get out of the adipocytes and be burned, people will want to exercise. I know that I could force myself to exercise when I was fat and cut the calories, and I would get down just enough to get under the military weight so I didn't get kicked out. Okay, and I did this for umpteen years, And I'm talking about running 40, 50 miles a week, and starving myself for 3 months before you had to weigh in twice a year. And you can do it, okay? But the older you get, the harder, and the more insulin resistant you get, the harder it is to do, and it's just not good for your body. So that's, and once I lost the weight, I wanted to get out and exercise. I exercise regularly, and so I always recommend it with your actual real-world patients. If they really want to lose weight, you got to get them on low-carb diet of some kind, and tell them not to exercise. Tell them don't exercise, and then we'll add the exercise later. And then after they've been on it for 2 or 3 months, you can say, "Do you feel up to some exercise?" and start them on a light program. And then gradually they'll want to exercise. But if you get somebody who's trying to lose weight and in the change of a new diet and all this kind of stuff, and then try to throw exercise on top of it, it's just not going to be very effective. At least that's what I've found out in the years I've helped people go on low-carb diets and lose weight. Okay? So exercise is a great thing. Everybody should do it, okay? But it's not the secret to getting weight loss in your patients. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent trying to get kids to exercise and be active in school. Do you think that money was well spent? No. Okay. In this study, they looked at 206 school children in England, and one of the schools had a supervised physical education class for 1 hour a day, was supervised, and the other 2 schools provided no PE at all. So they gave the kids actigraphs, which are basically Fitbits, and they monitored them for 2 weeks. And what they found was that the children from the school with PE had much higher levels of total physical activity, TPA, and medium to vigorous physical activity during the school hours. The children from the other schools that didn't have PE had much more of both TPA and MVPA after school. Okay? And over the course of the 2-week study, all the children had the same level of total physical activity and moderate to vigorous physical activity in all the schools. It's just that the kids that didn't have a PE class in school, so these kids seem to have an activity set point. And you can spend millions and millions of dollars to get them active in school, but it's not going to change the overall level of their activity, most likely. Are Americans getting fatter because they're eating more calories or more fat? There are a couple of studies. The data from the NHANES, from 1990 to 2010 finds no association between increased calorie consumption and weight gain. While obesity was increasing at a rate of 0.37% per year, caloric intake remained virtually stable. Okay? And the same thing goes for fat and eggs. From 1976 to 1996, the average fat intake decreased from 45% of calories to 35%. Butter decreased by 38%. Animal protein decreased by 13%. Egg consumption decreased by 18%. Grains and sugars went through the roof. Okay, and we all seen what happened, the obesity epidemic. And in England, it was the same story. Actually, the average calories in England during the same period went down. Okay. And while obesity was going through the roof. So it's not calories in, calories out causing the obesity epidemic. This is a champion of the set point theory and one of the early researchers, Ethan Allen Sims, a great-grandson of an American hero, Ethan Allen, and he was in the Revolutionary War, and he was at the University of Vermont for 60 years, started there in my birth year, 1950. And anyway, he did a very interesting experiment with prisoners in the Vermont jails. What he did was to take naturally thin prisoners and fatten them up by giving them extra desserts and extra food, and a lot of them volunteered for that. And he found some overweight prisoners who volunteered to calorie restrict themselves, and he calorie restrict them until they lost a little weight and got down to the same level as the thin prisoners that he'd fattened up, and they weighed the same on average. So he got this group of naturally fat and naturally thin, And when he measured their metabolic rate, okay, the basal metabolic rate of the naturally fat was half what it was of these thin people that he fattened up, because the thin people had raised their metabolic rate trying to burn off these extra calories to get back to their set point, and the fat people had decreased their metabolic rate because they wanted to try to get back to the fat set point. Okay, so it was an interesting experiment, and that was done in the early 60s. Okay, so how do we fix the set point in people that are fat? Okay. The thermostat, I'm just going to tell you, the thermostat is the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is what controls metabolic rate through releasing, among other things, thyrotropic hormone, and it's it normally turns down the rate if leptin goes up. Leptin is a hormone that's made by fat cells in your body and released into the blood. And so the fatter you are, the more leptin is released. And so the hypothalamus knows then to turn up the thermostat, because you've got too much leptin, too much fat, and so it burns it down till the leptin level comes down a little bit. But it turns out that one of the quirks of the metabolic syndrome is that insulin tends to increase the release of leptin from the cells. And anytime a hormone in your body goes out of whack, goes up really, really high, the body reacts by becoming resistant to that hormone. One of the most interesting ways I thought to talk about this was Lupron. Does anybody? It's a gonadotropin releasing hormone inhibitor, and they give it to women to shut down their menstrual period. They give it to men to shut down their androgen production. They give it to people with prostate cancer, but mostly to women to stop their periods. Okay, it's called Lupron or Lupride. And how does it work? It's actually a GnRH agonist. So how does it work? It works because normally in women the GnRH agonists are released in short bursts for just a short period of time, and then that tells the pituitary to release LH and FSH. But when you give a big dose of Lupron, okay, it's continuously bombarding the pituitary, and so it just becomes GnRH agonist resistant, and it just shuts down everything, shuts down FSH and LH, shuts down the menstrual period. So that's how it works. And in the same way, if you become insulin resistant and insulin goes through the roof, then you start releasing tons of leptin, your hypothalamus becomes leptin resistant. So it's all technical, but so the real villain is insulin. So here's to show you what happens in insulin-resistant people. When they eat something, the insulin goes up much higher in people who have the metabolic syndrome. Okay, here the insulin levels go higher and return to baseline slower in obese people than in normal weight individuals. Okay, and there's another study. This is another study to show the insulin levels against body mass index. Okay, and in this study, the black bar is hyperinsulinemia. The light gray bar, the black bar, hyperinsulinemia. This one is insulin resistant, and the last one is hypersecretion of insulin. Okay, so all those insulin secretion, insulin resistance, and hyperinsulinemia all go up as the body mass index goes up. So it's insulin, guys. Okay. If you give people insulin, this is a 9-year diabetes control and complications trial. Okay. Again, the black bar is the probability that the people who went up over 5 points on their BMI. The probability of people going up 5 point. This is the percent of patients that went up 5 points on their BMI. So the gray people here didn't get insulin, okay, in this trial. black people these are the people who got insulin. The chances dramatically, they were almost 30% more likely to go up 5 points on their BMI than the people who didn't get insulin. So, it's insulin. Okay. Taking away insulin pushes the down button on the thermostat. Okay. How do we know that? Well, simple type 1 diabetics. What happens in a new type 1 diabetic? Okay, let's say it was a little boy who was really obese and he got type 1 diabetes. What would happen? He would waste away to nothing. Eventually he would die if not given insulin. Okay? Because insulin is a fat storage hormone. There's nothing to cause fat storage, and you can't keep the insulin in. And when the fat comes out so fast, one of the things the body has to do with it is make ketones. And so they're going to get diabetic ketoacidosis because of all the ketones being made with all that fat that's getting released because there's no insulin around to keep it in the cell. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to talk about, you're almost there, is stress. And you all have this in spades. Stress causes the release of cortisol, which is the other big player. Now, cortisol is really mainly a big player because cortisol, one of the things that it does is causes glucagon release. And glucagon causes your insulin to go through the roof. What do we give patients in diabetic crisis that have a blood sugar of 20 or 30? What would you give them? You give them glucagon, right? Okay, and that's going to bring their sugar up real quick. Well, you're giving yourself a shot of glucagon with every night's sleep you miss, okay? So, but people taking cortisol-related steroids get fat, so your body can't tell any difference between cortisol and prednisone. So if you put somebody on long-term prednisone, they're going to get fat, okay? People who have Cushing syndromes, that's long-term elevated cortisol, they get fat, okay? Okay, and if you take the cortisol away, in this case it was prednisone, they get thin, okay? So in this study, patients who had been on prednisone for years for kidney transplants were weaned off. They had a 25% drop in plasma insulin, a 6% weight loss, and a 7.7% decreased girth. So they went out, this study, they went out in Glasgow, Scotland, and they checked people's urine cortisol level, and then it correlated with all the markers of the metabolic syndrome. Okay? So cortisol goes right in there, and here we go. Here are you guys after a night on sleep. 24 hours of sleep deprivation raises cortisol levels by 100%. Okay? And it just goes with the territory. And then finally, what can you do about it to decrease insulin? One of the ways to decrease insulin is low carbohydrate diets. That's Dr. Robert Atkins. Okay, he had a debate with Dean Ornish, who is the champion of low-fat, very high carbohydrate diets. But anyway, in 2007, they published a study, a one-year study a randomized study comparing Atkins and Ornish and two other diets, the Zone diet and the Learn diet. So the only thing that the Ornish diet won was of course, LDL cholesterol, which actually I'm going to talk about that. I need to talk about it in just a minute. Which it went up by 0.8 in the Atkins and down by 3.8 on the Ornish diet. Everything else. Okay, if you look at body mass index, minus 1.65 for Atkins, 0.7 for Ornish. If you look at body fat percent, minus 2.9 for Atkins, minus 1.5 for Ornish. Look at HDL-C. HDL-C went up 4.9 in the Atkins, and it didn't go up at all in the Ornish diet. So it doesn't do anything for your HDL. Triglycerides went down 29. And in the Ornish diet, they went down 14, twice as much. Insulin levels, this is the big one, folks. Insulin levels on the Atkins diet went down 1.8, and on the Ornish diet, they went down 0.2. Okay? And in the systolic blood pressure, minus 7 in the Atkins diet, minus 1.9 in the Ornish diastolic, minus 4 in the Atkins diet, and minus 0.7 on the Ornish diet. So it doesn't do your blood pressure, you get fat. Okay. And the last thing I need to talk to you about is, this is the one-year VERTA results. VERTA is a study where they basically giving people the Atkins diet with an app. So basically, they took all these good things that happened at 1 year in the VERTA study, okay, and they plugged it into that same calculator used from the American Heart Association for the 10-year atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk score, and it decreased by 11.9 because of the good triglycerides, the blood pressure going down, the HDL-C going up. And so just in summary, calories in, calories out theory cannot be supported by science. Calorie restriction gives short-term results that are not sustainable and makes patients miserable and can permanently lower basal metabolic rate. Exercise contributes very little to weight loss, and eat less, move more is a losing strategy. The only way to reset the body's weight set point is to decrease the insulin level, and there are 3 main ways to do that. Low carb, fasting, which will be another lecture if you want it, okay? I didn't have time to fit the fasting in. And the other thing is you can use medications. They're not very effective, but these are the medications you can use that will lower insulin, okay? If you give people sulfonylureas and certainly insulin, you're not going to lower their insulin. The sulfonylureas will raise their insulin, so they're not a great idea. All these others, metformin, acarbose, orlistat, SGLT1 inhibitors, and GLP-1 agonists, and the glitazones will lower insulin. So those are all things that you should consider with your patients if you're going to go with a pill. Okay, so is there any questions, or take a break? And thank you guys for listening to me. Okay.